Hello and welcome to the UCLA Arts Lunch Labs. I'm Jane McCarthy, Director of Outreach and Engagement for the School of Art and Architecture. In this series of midday talks, we will meet with UCLA Arts faculty and explore the various research centers of the School of the Arts and Architecture. Today's conversation will focus on ideas, an incubator for cross-disciplinary architecture and design research within UCLA's Architecture and Urban Design Department. While the physical campus of Ideas in Culver City is closed, today we'll be led on a virtual tour with Professor Natasha Sandmeier. Professor Sandmeier's work and research straddles the worlds of architecture and visualization, with a long-standing focus on the role of media within the creation and production of speculative architectures and environments. She leads the postgraduate entertainment studio at Ideas. During the conversation, please feel welcome to put any thoughts or questions in the chat, and Professor Sandmeier will be able to address these at the end. And so now I am pleased to introduce Professor Natasha Sandmeier.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you so much to Jane for setting up these talks. It's great to get to know some of the programs in the department, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of these. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. All right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about our world at Ideas. Some of that is talking about the kind of campus and the environment that we've set up. And then I also want to talk about some of the research projects that the individual studios are working on. But I think first I wanted to start with some pics of the very first Ideas campus in Playa Vista, which I think was around 2013. I've only been there for the year, so this is kind of like some of the origin story. And the first space we originally had was the Hangar and former home. You can see that in the top left pic of Howard Hughes's Spruce Goose. And so we were already set within the context of experimentation and making. The campus was, and even in our new home, it remains smack in the middle of the kind of tech and media nexus of Los Angeles. And so the program and campus were established at a moment when we saw an influx of tech companies that were choosing Los Angeles's Silicon Beach over San Francisco and Palo Alto's Valley, like really strategically aiming to capitalize on the energy and the transition of the city from one that was focused for so long on entertainment and, of course, manufacturing to one that now also kind of embraces technological exploration and innovation alongside a city that's finally trying to reconfigure its ideas around mobility and infrastructure. Thank you. Please, let's deal with the 405. So LA is a global hub of innovation and something that's easy to forget when we live in a city that's so dominated by Hollywood. And in fact, it has one of the largest concentrations of high technology industries in the country, and if not the world. So we've made LA our laboratory. It's a place that's dealing with issues of mobility, of density, and how to become a sustainable city, and how to live and work today, integrating technology, and how to better communicate with all of those concepts, with language, with imagery, and work that communicates to bigger and more diverse audiences than architects can usually capture. Frankly, we're notoriously bad at talking to anyone outside of our field. We use like really insular language. I try not to. And that's something that in the Ideas campus, we're really trying to confront as we make it a focus to reach out to audiences and to disciplines and designers and companies that talk about where we're all collectively headed and how to design the best possible futures. So that's kind of Ideas in a nutshell, in a sense. I'm going to show you the map because I hope that one day we can all meet there. If you've not been to see us before, our campus is located down here in Culver City, within walking distance of the brand new and very beautiful Margot Levin Graduate Art Studios. We will aspire to also having as luxurious a home and beautiful a home as one day. And so we're all located, again, at that kind of nexus of tech and media. And so hopefully you'll be able to join us at some point in the future. We have a lot of really great, super fun demos with robots, with VR, and a whole host of interactive pieces that Tyson Phillips, our lab guru, designs in collaboration with the students and studios. And so Ideas Campus is really an incubator for new ideas. It's a hub for industry collaborations, for public events, and other kinds of curatorial programs. And so some highlights from last year were some trips out in the field to Mexico City here. I think it's obviously Disney land. And then in the middle, Greg took his students as well to Boston to meet with manufacturers of the Gita robot. And then this pic is at his studio where he also has several prototypes. Again, to our annual symposia and events on the right with Jeffrey's Land Symposium, where he brought in a range of specialists to talk about the future of LA. And our own entertainment workshop in the bottom image on the left with Oscar-winning visual effects production designer Volker Engel of Independence Day and Godzilla fame, and Johannes Mücke, who's an architect and graduate of UCLA's AUD program and a production designer for Independence Day 2 and Singularity and other films alongside his architecture practice. And I think that's really a great kind of example of how someone has been able to create a practice that crosses across disciplines. Let me move on. So again, we're a kind of combination studio workplace, laboratory, and exhibition space, and that's kind of the best forum and place and space for experimentation. So here you see the sort of range of work that we'll be getting into. So I wanted to first take you through the space. It's kind of big square warehouse. We've got studio environment and then a lot of tech spaces, learning and workshop spaces. And here we've got the Robotics Lab. Let me just play the video. There we go. So ultimately, we're kind of a studio adjacent to a tech lab, one that features 4 industrial robots. 2 are the largest robots that anyone has in an architecture school setting. And then we have 2, like these 2, the smaller tabletop version that we use for demos before we program the big ones. And so technology spaces in schools all over the world are really trialing how to use robots to print with all sorts of materials, from liquidy plastics to ceramics, and at the super large scale even works thinking about how to print with concrete as architects test the printing of buildings. At Ideas, we do that as well, alongside integrating the robots into forms of experience design. We use them for some of the more complex filming tasks. We'll program them to track, more complex motion camera motions. We use them to choreograph projection performances, and you'll see some of that a little bit later on in the video. We integrate the kind of movements of the stage or of the panel that the robot's holding up with augmented reality overlays. And we also explore how we can use them to shape and transform large-scale architectural sets and stages, and pretty much every scale in between. Ultimately, the creativity isn't inherent in what the actual robot can do, but in deciding what you attach to the head. So here they've got a kind of clamp that will grip the plywood. In another one, you might see, like here, we have attached a printing head that's printing ceramics. And so the creativity is in designing the head that the robot can hold, whether it's a TV mount, a sensor, a concrete printing spout, whatever. We kind of are designing the interface between technology and experience. And then just adjacent to that, we have the virtual and augmented reality lab. Play this quick. I'm going to jump to minute 1. And here you can get a sense of the kind of augmented imagery that sits on top of the 2D here. This was a quick experimentation last year's during the summer session, where they're trying to add context and story and add texture and dimensionality to the world that we already know. Let me jump ahead as well. Again here, so what you can see is an interactive model that takes on board, frankly, technology that's already being used in medical contexts for surgery demonstrations and tests, and for engineering and industrial designs where they test integration before manufacturing. And so what we're doing also is thinking about how we might exploit that kind of use of technology within architecture. I mean, if anyone in our audience is familiar with or has played with Pokemon Go, that was a kind of super surprising moment an effective overlap of the real and virtual world, where you played a game in both kind of mental spaces. You played it in the physical and the virtual. And so while all of these technologies are really amazing in game contexts, it's important we think through and design applications within architecture. The possibilities to overlay experience and information through augmented reality and virtual reality is huge. And so I think that's where ideas is really strategic in trying to stay on top of technologies and think ahead to where they can go. So within the ideas campus, we have 4 studios. Entertainment, where we focus on storytelling, creative content, media, and film. We have the mobility studio, which really looks at new modes of transportation and integrating the kind of micro transports into multimodal hubs and micro mobilities. We have the technology studio, where they're really emphasizing the kind of integration of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and the kind of forms of extended reality like VR and augmented reality. And then, of course, we have the urban strategy studio, where they're looking at issues of urban growth, building types, sustainability, and more recently, of course, issues of massive climate crisis. So I'm just going to start with the mobility studio. And this is taught by Greg Len with Yara Fagali. And the studio, and here you can see one of the students walking with Gita, who's carrying his groceries. And the studio really focuses on the dynamic aspects of architecture, of people in motion, alongside other sorts of smart systems, as machines, in particular vehicles of all sizes and speeds. And if any of you are in Santa Monica, of course, you see every kind of Bird, Lime, and whatever all the scooter companies are that have proliferated down there. As vehicles of all sizes and speeds are integrated into our environments, as they gain intelligence, they'll also be able to act and interact with people more intimately. And that kind of new conflation or collapse of people and machine really challenges the existing kind of thresholds between buildings and what we normally think of as transportation infrastructure. And so there's now an opportunity to think of the design of spaces and environments that are shared by people and machines. Architects often think of those types of problems as technical or technological and not necessarily spatial and experiential. But I think what Greg and Yara are doing is thinking about how to integrate this kind of technology into a way that really starts to force architects to confront how we think about our buildings. They're not technical problems, they really are experiential. And so we need to go beyond the kind of bike rack or the drive-in car drop-off to think about the relationship and integration of spatial experience and transportation. And so that includes questions of like volume, of enclosure, of lighting and air around everything as it moves. And so I think what's interesting about particularly how Mobility Studio has addressed the realities of 2020 is how they've pivoted as well their approach to what they're doing this year and thinking about the mobility of people and air, looking very carefully into ideas of health density. And this is all work from previous years. We don't have, of course, the work that we've all started from 3 weeks ago. But just as this plays in the background, I want to talk about what they're working on after investing so many years working on collaborative workspaces and thinking through the implications of collective, of humans and technology working together. 2020, of course, brings very real challenges into this kind of work. And it's something that they've really confronted head on. We've spent years thinking about efficiency, optimization, about density, and suddenly the world changes and we're looking at like drawing a circle around yourself and not wanting or asking anything to come into it. We're looking at like our maximum radius. We're looking at minimizing any crossover. We're looking at how to get from the ground floor of a building to the top floor of a building without encountering too many people, all while managing to move massive volumes of air. And so the vision of the studio is to place the optimization of fresh air in terms of also thinking about how to design forms of interaction that don't feel like we're all isolated from one another. Of course, the reality is, moving into or walking into a kind of moving cabin, an elevator, right now is something we're all avoiding. But the studio, through really thinking through movement of air, is kind of driving a fundamental shift away from defining value by quantity and density to defining value in terms of flow, whether that's flow of people, of machine, of infrastructure, and of air. And so they're doing all of that with all of these particle simulation tools, where the particle may be the molecule of air, or the particle may be the individual, or the bird, or air, or scooter, or laptop mover, and conveyor belt systems that are in the spaces. And so that's where I think the idea studios sit at the forefront of these kinds of issues that enable us to immediately pivot and respond to either the questions or the crises of our times. So you can see a lot of movement in buildings. I think what's a really interesting kind of aspect of the way Mobility Studio works as well is in integrating kind of mobility into buildings that we just don't experience. And I think the more and more we see and are exposed to these kinds of images, the more we can start to think about that kind of overlap in our world. Okay, I'm going to talk about the entertainment studio. This is the studio that I teach with Nathan Su. Let me just set up our show reel. And also, Jane or Billy, if the audio is too loud on this background, let me know. Okay, so the entertainment studio is really built around the practices of world building and speculative thinking. We work within the context of those kinds of contemporary frictions and the tensions between technology and media and culture. And we use story as a device to connect those three things together alongside their inevitable impacts on social and spatial and societal structures. And so ultimately what the studio has been working on and will continue to do through visual storytelling is to really activate the agency that we have as architects in shaping the narratives and the spaces of our cultures. And so whether students situate their projects at the leading edge of high tech or within the kind of super ultra analog, we really prioritize the incorporation of science into our worlds and into the myths and narratives of our fictions. And so that's what makes them believable. Take any near future fiction writer, from William Gibson to Neil Stevenson or Octavia Butler or Margaret Atwood. The contextualization of those stories through a deep understanding of historical context and lineage, alongside an understanding and knowledge about the technology within a particular timeline, is what makes those stories resonate. And so that's where I feel that our work is really crucial in terms of bringing together the relationship between technologies and cultural truths or contemporary issues. And so last year's projects ranged from what we just saw on the screen, which was a kind of treatise on affluenza, offering an alternative to our current culture of waste with all the bags. And this one was a film called Incognito, and it's a crime and mystery film that I think really skillfully wove together technology and story by channeling the minds of two investigators. So we had a human police detective and an artificial intelligence analyst. And that within that, then we were able to reveal the contradictions inherent in what effectively is collected as cold, hard forensic evidence. And then, of course, remembered testimonies, which in large part can be hugely subjective. And then this project, which was a video game that explored new planets and the capacity of building relationships in online multiplayer environments. Okay. So our studio, like all of the studios in Ideas, is an interdisciplinary learning environment. We collaborate with visual storytellers, with VFX artists, with concept artists and production designers, and of course, architects, to develop the agency we have as architects and designers to speculate on and really design the worlds and legends of tomorrow. And as I mentioned, we focus a lot on world building. And so this is a scene from the missing persons investigation that I just talked about, where you see all of the evidence that's contained, all of the artifacts of the missing person case packed into a single image and room. That is one that we repeatedly return to in the film. All stories mine contemporary issues. Here, the kind of excess of plastic, building an entire story from the perspective of that most vilified of things, that crappy little plastic bag. That little plastic bag that fills up our cities, and seeing them in motion and at scale in this film really forces us to question our own wasteful actions. To another story that looked at the ways in which technology and nature constantly battle to dominate one another, and that kind of ebb and flow of takeover that in the last scene of the film really follows the path of Donna Haraway's writings, in which opposing forces of the battle ultimately joined together to become neither ecology nor technology, but like here, our little tech insect bee with his crude little TV head, but it kind of together they bring the dawn of a new, what we were calling the ecotechnium. And again, it's still from our game team. The film was called Innermost. And so while the work was predominantly delivered through film, this team really worked to kind of develop a multiplayer game that was as much a soul-searching process as a world-building process. So as you cultivated your world, you were really answering questions about identity building. And then this team of students who were super driven to develop the world and architecture of their narrative. And so within the context of the studio, we're really aware about working with students to identify how they want to champion their expertise as architects in designing these stories. Some really focus on environment design, others in crafting experience, and others in designing the stories of our near futures. So I'm going to move into the technology studio, and this one's taught by Guvench Ozel and Benjamin Enemoser. And they're really working with machine learning, artificial intelligence, extended reality and VR. And the goal of the studio ultimately is to explore and develop the relationship, I think, between architecture and the leading edge of design and experience technologies. And what that means is that they're working on ways in which architecture can be enhanced by and built with media. And so we're all trying to challenge that just because buildings don't move, the discipline of architecture itself does not need to be so fixed and permanent. Our world is in flux, and anyone awake in 2020 knows that better than ever. And our world is changing really all around us in terms of the shape of politics and identity, in terms of environmental transformation we're in the midst of, including, of course, the pandemic. It's also in flux in terms of the technologies we use with abandon. All of that is moving us more and more indoors behind walls, while we continue to communicate more and more beyond or outside of these walls, like I'm doing today, and like we are all a part of. And so students at the Ideas Technology Studio investigate the design of new media in digital and physical forms with the potential to radically transform the human experience. So let me play this. And what that means is that they're working on ways in which architecture can be enhanced by and built with media. And so our world is really looking at the ways in which, well, I guess the way the students have been doing it is using machine learning and AI to think through and about how cities can be designed and how we can embed that flux into the design and making process. And so in this part, you can see the examples of the AI generated patterns of cities that they've been developing by training the computers to see and learn and understand what makes an image of a city. And so they've been able to use that kind of developed intelligence in order to generate new versions of those, applying certain programming requirements and densities, and allow, in a way, or experiment with having the computer develop those kind of urbanisms. And so It's what they're calling a deep urbanism project, and it uses these kind of learning algorithms to create new urban forms. And then we also have, I think, coming up some examples of what they'll be delving into more deeply this year. A couple of projects showcasing their sort of extended reality and interactive media work that blurs the line between the physical and the digital. And so what you see in the studio, and when I first visited the campus a couple of years ago, it was during one of the final reviews. The whole space is in darkness, and they'd set up all of their models as kind of experience pieces. And so a jury is rarely the kind of experience where you see work on the wall and then you respond to it. A review with invited guests and critics is much more a kind of collective walk through a series of experiences. And so models are never just, what we understand an architectural model to be. They're constantly in flux, in motion. We understand them not in terms of the material they're made of, but in terms of the experience they're trying to communicate. And so, what they were working on last year and recent years, as well as training the computer to kind of make forms of architecture. And they're exploring new design methodologies that work to develop possible collaborations between AI and human designers, much like our criminal investigation, looking at that kind of possible overlap. And so in this project, machine learning algorithms were trained from a database of images and then taught to transfer that style. And so what they're working on this year is a studio called Virtual Presence. And I think what they've done is really creative in terms of addressing the reality that all of our students are spread across the globe. We have very few who are currently in Los Angeles. And so that reality is really more relevant, this idea of virtual presence. And so they're using VR to connect and work together in the same spaces, despite being spread out all over the world. And so I'm going to just run this one. And so this is an example of the technology studio, a seminar from a couple of years ago where they were learning to experiment with some of the kind of mapping. You'll see in a moment a student wearing VR goggles that's also moving a kind of augmented object in space. And they're designing this year what they're calling the virtual cocoon and exploring what, I guess what they're calling cybernetic domesticity, what it is and can be. And they're working with VR at the scale of the room, of the home, to the collective event and the city. And the lab has organized headsets for each of their students. So even though they're spread across the world, they can recreate a version of the studio and a version of their homes that all of the students can then access. And so they're using technology to figure out what digital togetherness really is and what it can be. And so that's going to be really interesting to watch unfold this year. And then lastly, I have the Urban Strategy Studio that's taught by Jeffrey Inaba and David Jimenez Iniesta. And the ambition of this studio is to develop new tools to design the contemporary city, given the very extreme changes we've witnessed environmentally and politically in recent years, and to propose urban environments that will thrive in this kind of context. And this year, the studio is really looking at climate risk posed by California's wildfires that, of course, threatened major cities this summer. And this is an image from last year's studio, which was a proposal for a post-earthquake Los Angeles using debris and loose soil as the primary kind of means for construction materials. Another view of the same project that shows earthquake rubble, those kind of colorful little mounds at the base of the buildings being piled into new foundations and urban spaces for downtown LA. And so climate change is very visible and very real in our state. 2020 has been the worst year for fires in California again, right? The past 3 years have all set records for the worst fire season in terms of area burned. 4 million acres have burned this year, with California having its first gigafire event, 1 million plus acre fire that I believe continues to burn. And so the Urban Strategy Program has a really great kind of collaboration this year. They're working as a part of what's called ARC DR3, a collaboration with 11 universities across US, Asia, and South America. And the work of the Urban Strategy Studio is going to be presented in collaboration with all of those schools in symposia in Japan and Los Angeles. And so not only are we working on crisis in Los Angeles and California, but that kind of opportunity to talk about these problems and address issues at the level of the global is super important as they relate to how that kind of implementations and strategies are being used in different cities around the world. As we look specifically at Los Angeles, and as LA builds further and further into wildland areas through terraforming, and this is a photo of Bel Air in, I think, the 1950s, and more of its land is really subject to threat of fire, and no wonder, including major landmarks like the Griffith Observatory, and then, of course, the Getty Center. They've both been under siege from fire within the past 2 years. And so in response, the studio is developing new kinds of topographies that can live with fire and be the basis for new zones of recreation and leisure for residents. So we can really think about how to, instead of just ignore the crisis, design with and through it. And here, one of the projects from last year that was presenting a kind of new agricultural oasis to protect food sources from the city and from crisis in the future. So this is a pic from one of the events last year that we will hope to have in 2021 again, and invite all of you to. The studio really engages with thought leaders around the world. Last year, they hosted a day-long event on land design with speakers from Spain, across the US, as well as hosted talks with architects in Milan, in New York, in Mexico, Mexico City, and of course, local leaders like LA's Director of Planning, Vincent Bertoni. And this fall, the studio is also hosting talks by fire experts with journalists and the city's chief resilience officer, and architects throughout the Pacific Rim. And, you know, it's really going to be a great series of events. There'll be also, many of those will be public, so we'll hope that we can send out those links and invitations to you all as well to join. Because ultimately, I just have a last couple of slides about the Idea Studio's kind of mission or desire to connect. Like, we have always worked very closely amongst ourselves and work closely with industry partners and nonprofits across all the topics of the studio to consider how emerging developments in these industries might impact the built environment. And so we're not really asking students to train as students, we're asking the students to train as future leaders in their disciplines. And so by engaging with experts from other fields, we have the opportunity to expand architecture's field of influence and leverage design to propose alternative, much more intelligent futures. So ultimately, students not only join a team of students and educators, but also industry partners. And I think that kind of relationship builds a really strong foundation for future. And so some of our collaborators in the past or recent past have been Boeing, Cirque du Soleil, Coachella. We've worked with Microsoft HoloLens and Red Bull, as well as Hyperloop and SpaceX. So a really kind of broad spectrum of collaborators. Again, I'm going to push the events because I really hope that we can hold these in person soon. And I desperately wish for all of you to be able to join us as we kind of work towards building again that kind of in-person relationship with think takers and makers and industries across Los Angeles and beyond. And we hope to be holding those again very, very soon. And these are just other examples of our reviews and discussions and exhibitions. And I think what's been the silver lining in our move to remote teaching and learning more recently has been that we've been able to bring in critics from literally all over the world at all of our reviews and discussions and events. And that's been an amazing resource to be able to tap into, to be able to think about how these conversations, while founded and developed in Los Angeles, have the capacity not only to kind of reach outward, but invite in so much contribution and feedback. So I just want to end here with something that I had heard Hitoshi Abe say in the very early days of the Ideas Lab, and that he said the Greeks originally defined architecture as the grand technology, which means the unity of technologies. And technology keeps advancing, so you have to keep redefining yourself, or our profession will only be about how to stack bricks. And so none of us want that. So yes. Okay, thank you so much. I'm happy to take some questions. I see there was a comment that was sent in earlier yesterday about what opportunities undergrads have to get involved in ideas. Formally, I don't know what those are, but honestly, I would be happy to have any and all of you join us at our reviews. Those review schedules get sent out by AUD. I think they go to a fairly broad mailing list. When we're in person, I'm happy to host events, particularly for undergraduate students as well, to have you all in and be able to share in the conversations that we're having. And then we can work with the school to answer those questions. What machine learning system was used for generating urban landscapes? I'm sorry, I don't know. I would have to ask Guvench and Ben. But I can also pass that question along and find a way to answer that. There's another question. Is there a simulation component of the architecture design process to evaluate structure in case of earthquake or environmental impact? I don't know that any of the studios are working on that this year in particular, or in previous years. I don't know about the legacy of what all of the studios have worked on in the past, I guess, close to 8 or 9 years. How can we join the mailing list or keep in contact in the loop with ideas? Let me find that slide. You can email ideas at aud.ucla.edu, and we'll be able to, there you go, thank you so much. We'll be able to fold you into all of our events and reviews. Another question we received, how might a user experience designer and researcher move into this field as a researcher with no professional experience in architecture? That's a tough one. In our program specifically, we do require a professional undergraduate degree. And I think in terms of moving into the field of either any of those programs, I think that's going to be something worth researching with regard to other kinds of design programs that may or may not be open to students without a professional architecture degree. I'm just going to scroll through the chat to see if I've addressed all of them. So I don't know if you can see, can they see the chat? Is that available to everybody, all the panelists? Jane? Yes, you'll be able to contact the email in the chat, and as well, we've got our Instagram account. You can also forward your questions via Instagram to the AUD Instagram and to Arts, and that can get sent on to our team, and then we'll be able to answer those questions in more detail. I'm going to stop sharing.
Hi, I just wanted to jump in to say as well that this recording will be available on the UCLA Arts YouTube channel, where we're putting all of our previous events, lunch lab talks, all of these things. So it will be available there, and we'd love people to check it out and share it widely. Because what Ideas is doing is incredible. Thank you so much, Natasha, for presenting us with what is happening at Ideas. It's kind of amazing, the scope of research that's happening and the infinite possibilities that presents. And so it's a lot of exciting stuff. And as you pointed out, we're at such a turning point right now with what this pandemic means, how we're going to relate in the future to one another, that I think Ideas really is going to be the thinkers coming out of Ideas will really lead in this field and help us shape what our future is going to look like in many ways. So I want to thank Natasha again. Thank you all for attending. By all means, check them out on Instagram, go to the website for Ideas at UCLA, and please stay in touch with everything they're doing because it is really exciting research. And Next week, we'll be having our final lunch lab. It will focus on City Lab, also within the Architecture and Urban Design Department, and that will be led by Dana Cuff. And I'm just going to quickly put in the chat the link and the time for that if folks want to tune in again next week to join us for another conversation about what is happening at UCLA in its various research departments. So again, thank you so much, Natasha, and everyone have a great Thursday. Thank you.